And really at the moment, and really throughout year 12 and year 13, the best thing that you can do for making a very competitive application is just to be engaging with content that's related to your subject that takes you beyond the A-level curriculum. But I thought it'd be useful to go through these things. Three sort of ways in which you can start actually shaping this kind of engagement. So sort of, I suppose, hopefully at the end of this session, you'll appreciate that there is quite a big difference between just doing some stuff that happens to be a little bit harder than A-level and doing things in quite a specific way that will actually enhance a competitive application along with numerous other things. So the first thing I'll spend a little bit of time just going over is actually just the rationale, just understanding why we think this kind of stuff is important. And the reason I think that's so useful is that once you know a little bit about why we actually value this kind of stuff, it's easier for you to be a bit more self-critical, a bit more critical about the resources and things that you're looking at. And hopefully, as you'll see in a second, you'll be able to sort of ask some quite particular questions about your own engagement. The next thing is actually resources, and I think I've pointed you from previous sessions. I've pointed you in the direction of good resources that you can sort of use and draw on for free online. And I just wanted to go into a bit of detail about a few of those resources that are of particular importance or of particular interest because of the way that they end up making you do some of this independent work, this supercurricular engagement. And then finally, there are just a few suggestions for tools, ideas, sort of basically just some less academic but equally important ways of going about doing this kind of engagement that I think I might have touched on before, but some of them it's either worth going over or some of them you might not have heard of. So to start on this first idea of rationale, I've just listed 5 reasons that we think supercurricular engagement is important for A-level students. And they're quite interconnected. But the idea is that often when people are told to do supercurricular engagement, when they're told to look at stuff beyond their A-level curriculum, it's not entirely clear why they should be doing that. There are lots of cases of schools, for instance, that will tell their students, oh, you should read 10 books to put on your personal statement or something like that. And it's quite opaque in the sense that there's no real benefit. It's just, it seems like everything is sort of directed towards doing the personal statement rather than anything perhaps more concrete or practical. So these are 5 of the reasons that we think that this kind of engagement is useful. One of the first, which I've talked about quite a lot before, is the idea that engaging with this content shows us that you will be suitable to you to get on well doing a degree at Cambridge or Oxford or at a competitive university. There is a lot to be there is a lot of independent learning that sort of goes on at university, and being able to do that work, being able to do being good at independent learning is a really good attribute. It's something that we look for a lot. So one of the primary things that we're looking for when we read your personal statement is, would this candidate be able to do a lot of independent work at university, such that, for instance, they'll have something to talk about when they have supervisions. They'll be able to produce an essay or answer mathematics questions in such a way that sitting down with an expert to discuss that content will be useful for them. And it also tells us whether or not you've picked the right course. If you've spent a lot of time engaging with content beyond A-level, specifically to do with the course you want to study, then hopefully you'll have a clearer idea of whether or not a particular course is actually right for you. And that applies not just to the actual course content, but also the methodology. There are further questions that you can ask about whether or not you want to do a particular course than just, do I like the content? Lots of disciplines end up using the same content, but in slightly different ways. One example is history, political philosophy, and politics, for instance. Those are 3 different disciplines that could well focus on the same primary text, for instance. but they have very different methodologies, very different approaches. And the only way to really understand whether which one of those three, for instance, you'd want to actually pick for an undergraduate is to engage in this kind of content. That links to selecting an enjoyable course. And also, we think this stuff is important for both A-levels and higher education. So it's not just about a competitive application. Applicants who do this kind of stuff firstly end up making their undergraduates a lot easier because it's just not such a big jump from supercurricular material to undergraduate as it is to for someone who's just done A-level and then is jumping to undergraduate. It bridges that transition a little bit. And in the same way, it helps with A-levels. It helps when you need to deploy specific things in an A-level exam, for instance, in a biology essay, or even in sort of more essay-based subjects like English, where you need to deploy content that does go beyond the curriculum. There are instances where A-levels themselves sort of demand supercurricular content to get the highest marks. And also, in general, just engaging with content beyond A-level improves the sophistication of things like exam responses or coursework. And then the final reason that we think this stuff is really useful is that it's important to other aspects of the admissions process. So it's not just important for writing a personal statement. It's important for instance, interviews. When we interview candidates, we often present them with new information that we hope they haven't seen before. And one way to do well at an interview is to be comfortable with constantly answering and engaging with new resources that are actually unfamiliar, rather than getting bogged down just trying to revise the same things over and over again. It's that sort of new engagement and ability to sort of be quite flexible and critical with unfamiliar material that we really value in something like an interview. So hopefully it makes sense why I'm sort of sharing this with you. It's the idea that there is far more to supercurricular engagement than something like writing a personal statement. In fact, that's not really, although that's the main way in which we're first acquainted with you doing this sort of stuff, it's not really the end goal of doing this. There are so many other reasons. And once you sort of know that that's how we consider supercurricular engagement, I think it does become slightly easier to think, oh, well, of this particular thing I'm looking at the moment, to what extent is me engaging with this content advancing any of these aims? To what extent is this helping me improve my capacity as an independent learner? To what extent is it helping me choose a course, to make sure I'm picking the right course? To what extent is this going to help me bridge the transition between A-level and undergraduate? To what extent am I going to be able to relate stuff that I'm doing back to my A-levels to ensure that I do better in them? And also, thinking about further aspects of the admissions process. Okay, so that's one aspect. And now I'm just going to go for a few resources. I think I know that there might be a question actually in the chat, but I can't see it, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll read it out. So just minimum grades for applications, they all need to be A-star, I think it's...
No. So if you're applying, and this differs between Cambridge and Oxford, but if you, if you're applying to Cambridge, then if you're applying to an arts and humanities subject, so something like English or philosophy or music or something like that, you need A-star AA. And if you're applying for a more science-based subject, so a STEM subject, that could be maths or natural sciences, you'd need A-star, A-star A. So you don't need all A-stars, but those are that's the min offer that we give. There's no we never lower it below that, but sometimes we might ask a candidate to get higher if we're unsure about the candidate. Sometimes what happens, which has positives and negatives, is that we will be unsure as to whether a candidate is quite good enough, and we'll ask them maybe to get A-star in a particular subject, or get 2 A-stars or something like that sometimes. And that obviously means that your paper application and interview don't always determine everything about our decision process. We might actually end up saying, you can come and study with us as long as you can show us that you can handle sort of workload at A-level appropriately in this way. But typically you're just going to get a standard A-star AA offer for arts and humanities, or A-star, A-star A. Yeah, we don't normally ask for more than that.
There's just a couple more questions now, Will, if you're right to just
Yeah,
quickly answer these ones as well. So yeah, Rosie's asked about the EPQ, which is it's quite relevant really, because if students want to do the EPQ at Candy, they apply for that in the summer term. So I suppose now is the key time to think about whether they're going to apply to do it, basically. So is that something worth doing, the EPQ?
it's definitely something worth doing. In terms of its effect on your application, it's sort of mixed. We're never going to include the EPQ as part of an offer, for instance. And also, obviously, remember that not everybody goes to a school where you can do the EPQ. So it's one of those things where if you're going to do the EPQ, you do need to do more than that. You need to engage with supercurricular content that isn't the EPQ. But it's an incredibly useful thing to have done. Going back to this slide, actually, with some of these things, especially with the independent learning aspect, we want students to be really good at completing time-sensitive projects at undergraduate level. It's possibly the best preparation that you can get. And one of the nice things is that you do get a bit of teacher support when you do it. It's not entirely on your own. You can discuss things with people as well. But yeah, it's in terms of setting you up to do well in something like the supervision system at Cambridge, it is an incredibly beneficial thing to do. But I mean, we don't, like I said, we don't put it as part of our offer. And if you realize that actually, you didn't want to do an EPQ, there's no sort of recommendation that you should. If you think that your time would be better spent engaging with stuff, engaging with supercurricular content, but not in that kind of slightly more structured way, I think that's also fair enough. It depends on individual preference. But yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I mean, I can answer the second question, I think, really. I mean, so Rosie's asked about whether it can reduce an offer. Well, it may do at other probably less competitive universities, Rosie. So it may be that they would possibly reduce, or when it really comes into play actually is in confirmation. So when you get your results in August, if you slightly miss the offer, and again, this isn't necessarily Oxford or Cambridge, but if you slightly miss the offer, they would then go back to your application, and if you've got those extra things like the EPQ, that's when it can actually make a bit of a difference. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Will.
No. No, okay. I think that covers it.
Sums it up. Okay. And also, so would there be a chance to get an interview if you don't meet the grade criteria?
Well, it depends. I mean, if you've already got your grades, then unlikely. In terms of predicted grades, I mean, typically, if you're not predicted the sort of the standard grade, the standard grades, I think it's unlikely that we would interview. But it's not impossible. I mean, there are cases, for instance, where somebody will be predicted certain grades and we think that that's slightly jarring given their application. So somebody might not be predicted our standard offer. They might be predicted, A, B, or something like that. But looking at the rest of their application, especially if they've done something like a pre-assessment for us, which you do in some subjects, and all of that is really good, we might think, oh, should this candidate perhaps be predicted higher? Why have they been predicted that? And I know of some cases where, the admissions tutor, for instance, at another college has phoned up a school and said, are you sure about this? Is this what, we've looked at their application and it looks like they're really good. Why they predicted this? And sometimes it will turn out that a school doesn't predict, so, A stars in certain subjects or something like that, or they have an internal way of doing it that's at odds with what we'd expect. But beyond sort of administrative stuff like that, if you're not predicted the grades by your teachers, it's unlikely. So, I mean, my only advice there would be, it's not sort of too late at the moment. I mean, I imagine anyway, it varies between schools, but to be, working towards getting good predicted grades in something like a summer assessment, it is something that you have to consider if you want to apply to us. You need to make sure that you do very well in sort of teacher assessments and things that will be determining the grades. Does that help?
Yeah, that's fine, Will. I think if we've got a couple more questions coming through, but we could, I think if we let you continue and then we can come back to some more questions at the end. But the other thing I would just quickly throw in there is you know, if you're a student that maybe is not quite at the grades that are needed, then I think I did mention last week also about the foundation course that Cambridge have got, and also Oxford have got, so there might be something worth bearing in mind. But yeah, if we let you continue, Will, and then we can come back to some, I know we won't forget your question, Ram, we'll come back to that.
The the foundation year is something that definitely would recommend people look into. That's an incredibly good opportunity. It's basically us widening the number of people we're admitting by saying, well, no, not everyone has the same schooling experience, and sometimes people can be incredibly good even if they don't meet the standard offer requirements. So it's a way of letting people come and study with us without perhaps not through the conventional way that which we've always done it. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction for us. But yeah, I'll move on with some of this content quickly. I'm sure you've had time to look at this by now. I'm basically just going to run through a few resources that end up actually shaping your supercurricular engagement, which are sometimes overlooked, or people think that they need to be engaging with stuff that's even harder, when actually some of these materials are very, very useful. So this is one that's really often overlooked, is the course reading lists, and this is for undergraduate study, not prospective students. So this is there's an example taken from philosophy. A lot of my examples are philosophy because that's my subject. But rather than going to prospective students, I've gone to current students. And I just checked this is coming through, right?
Yeah, it's showing.
Good. And essentially, they're not always going to be accessible in this way. But say I go to metaphysics, for instance. What I get presented with is basically the entire first year reading list for metaphysics. So I get some preliminary stuff that I could look at, but I also I'm actually directed to actual topics. So here I've got causation, and I think focusing on Hume's view is a good thing to do, because people are often introduced to something like Humean causation in religious studies or something like that. So if you were interested in that kind of topic, then what the reading list does is it points you towards a very, very specific thing to look at, rather than pointing you towards an entire book or an unmanageable amount of literature. It says, look, if you want to know about Hume's view of causation, read section 4 of this book you wrote, or read this other book, read sections 1, 2, and 3 in this particular part of his book. And that might seem fairly basic, but it's a very, very useful to be directed in this way to very particular sections of books, and in a way that you can trust, because it's the academics who convene the course that are giving you this information, is a very useful resource. And as I noted on the on this PowerPoint, you will be able to find quite a lot of this stuff from us, but typically there'll be subjects that we won't have such a full reading list for, that's just accessible to anyone. And if that happens, you can just look beyond Cambridge, and you can look at Oxford, you can look at other places as well. But this is already a very useful resource that just changes slightly how you're looking at it, slightly changes your focus. And the nice thing is that you can use these kinds of resources. You can use you can get access to the sort of books and things that our website that recommends, using things like Open Library. And again, not enough people will use this when they're doing supercurricular engagement, but Open Library contains absolutely tons of resources. Some of them are incredibly niche as well. There's loads of interesting content on here. And typically you can type in a name of a book and you'll probably be able to find it or something related to it, and you can access it for free. And I've just noted here that it raises the probability that you can access the material. It doesn't guarantee it. But if you're using something like this, along with just standardly looking for resources on things like Google, you are significantly more likely to be able to engage with the stuff you actually want to. So using course reading lists in conjunction with something like Open Library is a really good way to sort of start engaging with content you find interesting. Another thing that you might have seen is HE+. This is quite similar to some other stuff as well. There's HE+, and there's also virtual classrooms that you might find on faculty websites. And with both of these, basically what they do, HE+, sorry, I should just note, contains basically every subject we offer at undergraduate. And sometimes you'll be able to find things like this on subject faculty pages as well. But the point of anything like this is that it gives you some very, very niche resources to engage with. So when I talked about course outlines or course reading lists, that's focusing your attention slightly. And with stuff like a virtual classroom, it's even better. So here, for instance, this is a source. So this is somebody who's interested in studying history, and they're interested in doing some further sort of super curricular engagement. And say they're interested in this topic, or they just want to have a look at it. One thing that they get is actually a lot of exercises for them to do. They get different questions to engage with and look at. So here, they're literally presented with a paragraph of text, literally just a text extract, and then they're given these sorts of questions. They're given some, and these are fairly basic in a sense when you actually look at them. What sort of person might have written it? Okay, so I mean that's something I've never really studied history in any formal capacity, but that's something I could have a go at answering. So I think sometimes people are put off using resources like this because they think that they're too basic, or they don't, or everyone else is using them. But what resources like this are giving you is actually a very good model for doing your own supercurricular engagement, your own independent research. And it's showing you here, for instance, that actually, when you're looking at a primary text, for instance, you should look at very small extracts. This is one paragraph, but apparently there's a lot to say and there's a lot to think about with this. And you should devote your time to actively engaging with it. You should be trying to answer questions like, who might have written this, and and maybe even thinking about what those questions, some consequences of those questions, and what, and deeper ideas about the questions themselves. But the point is that rather than directing you to a big primary text that you might try and sort of struggle to make it all the way through, just to say you've read it, for instance, this is giving you some real concrete stuff to focus in on. And that's sort of what we want to see when we look at your applications. People who end up actually using these resources actively, so they read the stuff, they make notes on them, they try and answer the questions, they end up doing a lot better, because they're following a model that we think is really useful for actual engagement. I mean, at undergraduate, the level of detail only gets more excruciating, the level at which you're expected to engage with texts and spend time looking at the details of them. So if you're using stuff like this, it's just encouraging you to work in the right way. And as should be kind of evident, the more time you spend doing things like this, the better set up you are for looking at stuff that isn't on sites like this. If you do want to, go further and look at, which, for something like this, you should have a look at other primary texts that you think are interesting that aren't necessarily featured on here. But the more time you spend working on something like this, the easier engaging with those texts will be. You start realizing that actually, in this chapter of a primary source, I need to spend a lot of time on each paragraph, and and that's actually worthwhile. Reading that paragraph through, making notes on it, really thinking about what's going on, that's actually something that's worth my time. So I hope that makes sense. And if that seems very obvious, then good, because lots of people don't do this.
Can I just mention something, Will, just to explain that, because I've just put something very random in the chat just before you move on. So I mean, someone recommended, I think, was it a Cambridge talk I was at, I think, recommended also Feedly. So if you're someone that works well with apps and things like that, and actually I kind of played around with it and I downloaded it on my phone, and it is great actually, because you can create a profile for yourself. So you can say, I'm interested in articles about psychology. It's all, and it is free, the basic version, and then basically you go on your profile, and I've got about 5 articles here written by the Psychology Research News that I can kind of look into. I can then visit the website, keep reading, whatever. So it's just just quickly drop that in there as something else you might want to play around with.
That's interesting. I haven't heard of that one. That's that sounds quite fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. And anything like that is, yeah, it is again really worth your time. The other one that I'll just quickly cover is Isaac Physics, and I think I've probably mentioned this to people who've been in sessions before. But that's simply because it is just one of the most useful things for anyone doing something vaguely mathematically orientated. And it's got I mean, it's very different, but it's got a similar structure, hopefully you can appreciate, to the other things at HE Plus or the virtual classroom, in that, I mean, the nice thing here is that there's a question finder. And if I go on level 5 or 6, for instance, in the question finder, I can pick anything from physics, maths, or chemistry to have a look at. I can, let's say, circuits, for instance, and I can look at, oh, no, you know what? There's nothing on that. That's a bad example. Interesting. This is why you stick with examples you actually use typically, because otherwise that can't be right. Okay, well, there's stuff on mechanics. Okay, so I guess we know that there's nothing on level 6 with waves. There is on level 5, but the idea is that this is taking you slightly beyond the A-level curriculum. It's taking you slightly beyond sort of A2 as it's defined here. And it's giving you different questions to work through. So here, for some reason, there are no level 6s for some of this stuff in physics, but it encourages you to actually look at different questions. And, you know, the idea is that you'd actually work through these particular questions. If you don't understand something, you are pointed to different sort of, very miniature lessons or different hints. You know, sometimes it will be a video, sometimes it will be, you know, just like a visual hint like that. Sometimes it will be a bit more text, and sometimes it will be pointing you towards some concepts and stuff. But students who work through this kind of stuff in anything like natural science or maths, they end up doing really well, because the one thing that we are so interested in these sorts of subjects is sort of technical competence in various areas. So a student who has worked through things in something like Isaac Physics, again, they've been given a kind of model for further engagement. You know, they've understood what sort of level the mathematics they're looking at, for instance, should be at, if they want to do anything else, and also how they should be engaging with it. And the key point to stress with all of this is it's active engagement that we want to see. It's not enough just to read a book chapter or just to watch a video about some mathematics. You have to actually be a sort of active participant in learning. You know, with this, you're actually, you know, you need to actually write down your working, you know, your responses and stuff. And the same with something like the virtual classroom for history. You need to be writing down your responses rather than sort of just thinking of brief. It's very easy with something like the virtual classroom to think of brief answers just in your head for some of those questions, like who would this have been written for? But the real benefit comes when you actually sit down and try to work through those answers properly. And I think that possibly also shows you how it's, when you're making something like a Cambridge application, we're less concerned with whether or not you're having super unique insights about the world, and we're more concerned with competence and the thing you're going to be doing. I mean, undergraduate is, obviously it's a jump from A-level, but it's not, you know, it's not, you're still sort of a student learning things in not the same way as A-level, but in a closer way than I think some people think. And so that's the kind of stuff that we're looking for. And then I'll just briefly say this as well, and that I've sort of been encouraging you to use resources that shape your experience, that make you sort of actively look at very specific things. There is virtue in thinking more broadly about stuff as well. And what that might mean is that you're sort of thinking a bit more fuzzily about the about your subject. You're thinking sort of about the more general shape of your subject, you know, how people are thinking about your subject at the moment, where your subject is situated in the academic landscape and stuff like that, rather than the specifics. And that is also a very useful thing to have done. That sort of more global outlook is often quite is often quite useful. And stuff like podcasts are often a very good thing to use there. There are a few other resources, podcasts being one. So using stuff like BBC, like In Our Time podcasts can be quite useful for that more holistic overview, or for starting it at least. You'll find podcasts that can actually be even more comprehensive, just to note as well. So here on the Faculty of Philosophy's website at Oxford, you've got a lot of you've got some stuff that's really useful just like for getting started. So, you know, philosophy for beginners, critical reasoning for beginners, stuff like that. But then you also have things like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is essentially, I think it's an 8-part lecture series or something that is incredibly useful for going into a lot more depth. But other things that might be useful for that sort of broader outlook are good news outlets. So The Conversation is one that is very, very useful. The nice thing about The Conversation is it's just written by academics, and it's not just about topical stuff like coronavirus. It's about it will cover things that are specifically relevant a lot of the time to a subject that you want to do. There was one the other week, I think, on something about Arthurian legends, for instance, and yes, sometimes you'll get stuff like that coming up on things like The Guardian, stuff like that. But typically this goes into a lot more detail, and there's also a diversity of opinion. There are lots of different views that academics will take on things like this, that can be very helpful for sort of gaining a comprehensive picture of how people are thinking about certain issues. And the other one I would recommend for the sort of broader outlook, but also maybe going back to the specifics as well, is social media. So this is possibly, Joe, what you were mentioning in a way as well a minute ago. I think it's really useful for people to make, if you don't already have it, for people to make Twitter accounts and follow things like, you know, academic societies, follow academics that you find interesting, or university departments, for instance. And the idea is that you'll get a constant feed of information of typically open access materials. And one thing that ends up doing is that it changes how you might actually come to be acquainted with certain topics. So the example here in the screenshot is this is a screenshot taken from, I think, a philosopher's YouTube channel, but they're advertising on Twitter. And this topic is it's both fairly dry and fairly complicated. It's about how certain operators and modal logic end up interacting. And typically this is pretty meaningless to anyone that you typically encounter it in second year in philosophy. And it's pretty meaningless, I think, to somebody who is interested in philosophy in A level. But if somebody comes to this kind of idea through a site like this, where it's very easy to see what they need to know to understand this problem, for instance, and why the problem is interesting and why it matters, somebody who comes to it through that kind of mode of presentation rather than an academic paper actually stands a chance of being able to engage with that content. And that's pretty significant, because if a student comes across this in an academic paper, I would be willing to bet quite a large amount of money that they would leave this alone, or that they wouldn't really get anything from doing it. But if they come to it from a YouTube channel like this, typically actually it is comprehensible. And if you put something like this in a personal statement for philosophy, I think admissions tutors or at least philosophy interviewers would lose it, because this is a very complicated thing for an A-level student to be looking at, but it's made accessible by things like this. So I think, spend a bit of time on that, but I think it's really worthwhile doing that. Does anyone? I've just got a tiny bit more to cover. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or any more?
I think, well, we've got one. Oh, got that stupid echo. I've got a question here about going beyond the reading list. So, you know, you probably sort of answered that, really. So there's sort of the expectation that you should go beyond what's on any reading list. I suppose, you know, by sort of reading things off the reading list, hopefully it should trigger off more enthusiasm to go on reading, I suppose. But there's not going to be there's not going to be like a tick list, is there, of how many things you should read or anything?
No. And I mean, the main thing is going beyond A level. If you're, I don't know. Maybe what I said was ambiguous then. So when I'm talking about going beyond, like, the A level curriculum, for example, that's the main thing you're doing. You're not just doing stuff that's featured in your A levels. But if you're taking, for instance, an undergraduate reading list, was that the question? Was it about undergraduate reading lists?
It was, but in actual fact, it was probably posted before you went into details. So maybe you've already answered that, but yeah.
Okay. But yeah, it's if you've done anything from an undergraduate reading list, that's amazing. Often it's actually just useful to use the reading lists to get the names of the topics that you then look at a slightly lower level. The point of showing you the reading list and the fact that you could engage with the content is that often, especially on the first year reading lists, the stuff they recommend is stuff that people typically read before actually coming up to university. Lots of people, for instance, in philosophy, will read Descartes or they'll read Hume or something like that. And the problem, though, is that they will often try and read all of Hume or all of Descartes, and they won't pay sufficient attention to small bits that's actually useful to engage with. One of the best things that you can do for stuff like that is to take a sample of something from a philosopher, for instance, like that, since we're on this example, and then to get some kind of walkthrough of that from either a video or another text. Often sort of critical guides to that sort of take you through argument by argument, try and reconstruct somebody's thoughts in a text are really useful for that. But yeah, there's no need to go beyond. I mean, that's why I referred you to stuff like HE Plus or virtual classrooms and things, because there's an extent to which you want to go beyond the A-level curriculum, but there's also an extent to which, once you go a certain degree beyond A-level, you kind of want to stop and really sort of get acquainted with that level of difficulty or sophistication. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Will.
Cool. So yeah, just finally, I'll just comment on a few resources that are very useful and again are overlooked a bit, partly because some of these are quite basic, but they can be very useful. First thing is that if you don't already have Microsoft Office, you can get it for free just by entering your school email address. It's hyperlinked on here actually. And the nice thing about Microsoft Office is that a lot of the stuff works on phones just as well as it does with computers. But the thing of particular interest is OneNote. And I think people who don't use this often think that it's very similar to Word, and therefore that there's not really any point using it if they already have something like Microsoft Word. OneNote is far more powerful than Word. It lets you do a lot more. And specifically, it's really useful for this kind of stuff I've been talking about, doing your own independent studying. I mean, it's useful for A-level too, but it gives you a lot of power in organizing all of the studying and learning that you're doing. And the other thing that's very useful to have a look at is reference management software. And for both of these, I just recommend maybe looking at a 5-minute video on YouTube, for instance, about why these are important and useful, and actually really trying to incorporate these into your sort of workflow, because it does make a big difference in how easy it is to manage doing this kind of stuff. The other thing I'll point you towards is browser extensions. I mean, you might already do this, but again, it's sort of, some of these things are a bit overlooked. OneNote and also most reference management software will actually have a browser extension, and this is really, really useful. I didn't actually use this when I was an undergraduate, and when I found out, I really sort of kicked myself because, for instance, here, this is a screenshot of the OneNote browser extension. It's sort of like a clipper. And one great thing it lets you do is it lets you clip particular regions from websites. So here, I've just gone on Khan Academy and found something that people often might look at in, as a super curricular thing for biology. And, I've just managed to clip this graph this diagram, sorry. and that then gets stored in OneNote, and then everything that I clip is in one place. And you can do that with looking at texts on the Open Library. You can clip all of the relevant paragraphs and things that you actually want to sort of analyze and think about more, and have them all in one place. So stuff like that is really, really useful. And I think it does make a big difference when you actually incorporate that into your workflow. And then there are other things as well, with stuff like you can get free extensions that read everything out loud to you. And again, that makes quite a difference in terms of but both in terms of just being able to listen to something rather than read it all the time, but also it makes a significant difference in how you engage with it, how you concentrate on looking at a particular thing. And also just having resources that, for instance, make sure that you actually can know what every word is that you're reading. I think that there's a danger sometimes when people do supercurricular engagement and they look at academic articles, for instance, that they're not always going to know every single word. And often academic articles are more accessible than people think, and sometimes it is just a jargon problem. So I would recommend having something like a Google Dictionary extension, just so that it's easy to look up things you don't understand. And I can sort of guarantee you that doing some of this kind of stuff really will help with your workflow, and obviously all of it's free to use. And then the final few things I just want to mention. I've mentioned these before for people who are who have attended some of these sessions, but I'll quickly say them again now. One thing that really helps with writing the personal statement, and also with sort of just keeping track of everything that you're doing with this kind of stuff, is just making a note of everything that you engage with, every sort of article or podcast or anything like that. And if you can use OneNote, you don't have to, obviously. You can keep all of these things in one particular workbook or tab. And that's just a nice way to sort of keep track of what you're looking at, re-engage with stuff. Very useful. And on the other side of that, you might also want to consider keeping a workbook. So as opposed to a diary where you are just jotting down the fact that you did something, in a workbook, you're kind of trying to encourage yourself to sort of be like I was saying earlier, be a sort of active participant in the learning that you're doing. And you might keep that as an adjacent OneNote book to your diary, and you might be able to see, you might sort of write down notes and thoughts that you're having as you're looking at a particular thing. And there are two reasons that that's primarily important. The first is that in any subject, a lot of the time, in most subjects anyway, there are technical aspects of study that are really, really important. And it's only by writing them down and actually sort of actively engaging in them that you're going to make any progress. And that's stuff, obviously that's stuff like mathematics and chemistry and physics, but it's stuff like prosody in English, and it's stuff like formal logic in philosophy, or anything to do with sort of foreign languages. All of that stuff, you benefit from actually writing things down. So you might use OneNote. Typically, if you're writing down maths problems, or even if you're doing something like Scansion, you might want to sort of write it down on paper. But the nice thing about OneNote is that you can just take a picture on your phone, and typically it sort of translates that into text and puts it on your and puts it all in one place on OneNote as well. So that's another reason why OneNote is very useful. It's good for organizing paper notes. But also written aspects, like making sure that you're answering the questions on something like the virtual classroom, or you're writing practice essays, or you're writing your thoughts down just generally, or taking notes. Those aspects are all important too. And keeping a workbook where you are actively writing things is one way of ensuring that you're actually doing the right kind of engagement. And obviously that's different to engaging with the right resources. You can look at the virtual classroom, and that's pointing you towards doing things a certain way. And having a place where you're actually writing down this kind of stuff, or at least a place where you're collating it all, is another aspect of encouraging you to independent learning in the way that we look for. And then finally, and again, I've talked about this before as well, so people will probably be a bit sick of this if they've been in other sessions, but there is a massive benefit to discussion groups of one variety or another. And this is very useful, obviously, for things like a Cambridge interview. because you are getting practice in actually talking about your subject, which is one of the most useful things you can do. But also just the mode of talking about your subject is very different to doing everything in your head and just sort of, doing everything on your own as a sort of independent endeavor. Actually collaborating with other students is a very, very useful thing to do. And I mean, one thing that you can do is that you can present topics, for instance. I've given you 3 suggestions here. You can present topics. That's normally quite a nice way of thinking through ideas. When you this is less of a relevant example, but it kind of applies. When you write academic papers, for instance, one of the best things to do is literally to present the topic or the idea that you have as many times as you can. And that often helps you articulate what you're doing. It's a different way of understanding the topic. But you also might literally start discussion groups. And you can do that with reading. You can do that with just topics and things in general, but you can do it with maths as well. I really don't think enough people, partly maybe because maths is already collaborative and you already sort of are doing it, but I don't think as many people as they should start discussion groups based on maths problems. It's very easy to do. It's probably easier than reading a whole article for a discussion group, just saying, well, we're going to focus on this problem that seems really hard this week. And that's another really good way to get a bit of practice talking about your subject. And then the final one is imitating our supervision system. I forget if I've talked about this before, but the idea is that in supervisions at Cambridge and Oxford, we are teaching you in a very particular way. Partly we are teaching you through academic discussion. So we might, in an interview, for instance, where we're mimicking the supervision system, we might present you with a new problem or a new idea, and we'll say, oh, what do you make of this? And one thing that we look for is for people to actually be making their thought processes transparent to us, showing us how they're approaching it, talking even about their thoughts as they're having them. And typically when students do that, they do very well. And one thing that you can do is literally start practicing talking about new problems as you're encountering them in real time to someone else. You might each pick, you say you're doing maths, you might each pick a really difficult problem on a step paper, for instance. Person A might pick one problem and person B might pick another. And you might each present that problem to the other person. And maybe you've both looked through your individual question before, worked out how you do it, different responses, and then you'd see what they make of it, and you'd get them to actually do it. And that's a really good way to practice for the interview, but it's also a good way to just continue engaging in your subject in a slightly different way than some of this more independent stuff. I hope that makes sense. I think that's basically all I have to say. Have any more questions come through, or does anyone want to ask anything by just unmuting? I'll stop the screen share actually if I can.
Okay, so we'll just give students a few more minutes to ask any questions, but we can go back now that we've thanks Will for all of that. It's always really useful. So I'll just go back to Ram's question, I think, which was asking about, I suppose, like contextual information. So does the university take into consideration individual cases? So, for example, like a student who may have only been in the UK for a year, etc.
Yes, very much so. I mean, we have a lot of we end up having a lot of information about individual candidates. I think people are often surprised at the level at which we're interested in sort of specific cases. Typically, we spend many hours on individual applications. Somebody at another college calculated that I think we probably spend about 50 hours on every application, for instance. And part of that, we are looking at contextual information. We are looking at we're looking at your school performance. We're looking at your performance in relation to your cohort. but we're also looking at extenuating circumstances. So we're looking at individual things that you tell us about, especially things like, not being in the UK for for that long, for instance. That's something that we think is useful to know. But then we look at other stuff that we get when even if you don't tell us. So we look at postcode, for instance. Postcode actually gives us quite a lot of information. We have various measures that we use to analyze postcodes. Some of it is, for instance, by how many people participate in higher education in that particular postcode, but that doesn't tell us everything, because some areas, we might think that there's contextual information that matters beyond that, for instance. So we look at other measures as well. But yeah, I mean, in short, we care a lot about this kind of stuff, and we are always pressing applicants to say, if there are extenuating circumstances, for instance, please tell us, because we're actually interested, and we will take it into consideration in your application. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. Right, I don't think there's any more questions coming through. So that's a huge amount of so many useful resources that students could go off and do. But so students, don't feel overwhelmed by all of this as well. I think there's not a prescriptive list that you have to do this and you have to do that. So and for some courses at university, they don't necessarily have to kind of have all of this, but hopefully you are going to be aiming high, and it'll be something you want to do, hopefully. So if there's no other further questions, I'll stop recording, and then we can just any last points, Will, you'd like to make?
No, only just that I think you made a good point about not wanting to do absolutely tons of this kind of stuff, not feeling overwhelmed. The point of trying to share all these resources with you at once is to say, this is the kind of stuff that's useful. And if you're doing say you're doing one thing a week, doing a little bit of time, spending a bit of time each week on something like Isaac physics, that's what we're looking for. You might sit down for 30 minutes to an hour each week and do a little bit of work on a particular problem you find interesting, and over time that builds up into actually having done quite a lot. So the thing we say is that it's important to start this stuff early and not start panicking that you haven't got enough to put on your personal statement. But it really is cumulative, and it shouldn't be consuming your entire life. It shouldn't be you shouldn't be spending every free waking hour doing this stuff. We don't want you to be doing that. And with something like arts and humanities, that's why we say don't read whole books. You get a lot more from reading particular chapters and things, but that means that you can spend more time on those things, and it means that you don't have to try and race through everything. You can spend you could spend a month on a particular topic that was interesting to you. Say you wanted to explore the relationship between the views of two poets, for instance, and you want to engage with those. You can spend a month or two looking at something like that particular question. So that would be my only comment. Like, please don't feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of this. So yeah, thanks so much, Will. And we will see Will again a bit later on. Can't remember when, but next week we've got Nathan and Dominic, our assistant principal and deputy director, who we're gonna try and split you into two groups, basically broadly kind of STEM students and arts and humanities students, and we're going to try and set up some more subject specific activities. Queen Mary University are currently, I've sent them a list of all of your interests, and they're going to try and set up some small group seminars for you. So we've got lots of exciting things in the pipeline. So so next week should be good. Hopefully you got the link. Any problems linking, then let us know. Cool. I can't stop the recording because all the messages keep coming up.
Should we just check when we're meeting again quickly?
Yes. Just going to stop recording.